The topic that we are going to discuss today is the types of counseling. Before going into types of counseling, the first important thing that we should know is what do we mean by counseling. So, according to Oxford Dictionary, counseling is none other than the provision of professional assistance and guidance in resolving personal or psychological problems. So, here two important things that we should note. First, very important thing is the professional assistance. So, what do we mean by professional assistance? So, here we should know that counseling can be given to any person only by a professionally assisted person, and any person who is in need of help can receive this counseling. So in counseling there are two sets of people who will be involving in this particular process. The first person is whom do we call as the counselor, the professional person who will be rendering the counseling, and the second person who always will be referred as the client or the counseling. So one thing we should note is in counseling always there will be two set of people who will be involved in the process of counseling. The first person will be referred as the counselor who will be giving the professional assistance or the professional help, and the second person whom do we refer as the client or the counselee who will be getting the help from the professional counselor. So now we are going to discuss about the types of counseling. There are three important types of counseling. The first thing is what do we call it as the directive counseling. The second thing is what do we call it as the non-directive counseling. And the third thing is the eclectic counseling. So there are three important types of counseling. The first thing is the directive counseling. The second thing is the non-directive counseling. And the third thing is the eclectic counseling. So these are the very important concepts that we should make a note and we should memorize it. First thing is, now we will see what do we mean by a directive counseling. So there is another name for this directive counseling. Directive counseling is also referred as prescriptive counseling. I'll just make it very simple. Directive counseling is also in layman terminology referred as the counselor based counseling or the counselor based technique. So here the counselor will be suggesting various solutions to the counselee or the client. So directive counseling is also referred as prescriptive counseling, or it is also referred by the layman terminology as the counselor based counseling. And there are some important steps that are involved in directive counseling. It just starts with the first step, which is known as analysis. So in analysis, the counselor will be analyzing the problem or the solution of the client. And the next very important thing is, after that, he will be synthesizing, he will be collecting the necessary information from the client, which always will be followed by one thing which is known as the diagnosis. In diagnosis, the counselor will be able to trace or find out what is the exact solution or what is the help that is needed for the client. And after that, the counselor will be progenesis. And next only the counseling session will be started. In counseling session, the counselor will be chunking the whole session into different modules. It may range from 1 week or 1 month, and even in sometimes this counseling session even it can be extended till 6 months. Depends on the need and depends on the solution mode of the client. And the last thing is what do we call it as the follow-up. So these are the important steps that are involved in direct counseling. And coming to the merits and demerits of this directive counseling, the most important merit of this counseling is it is very time saving. For example, in a de-addiction center, if this particular directive counseling is being used by the counselor means the counselor will be using a set of rules and regulation or will be using a set of guidelines to help the client to come out of that particular habit. So it is very time saving, it is organized, and it is very economical, especially when the counselor is, when the client is staying in somewhere else place, it will be helping the client. And coming to the demerits or coming to the limitations of this particular counseling is, this is a counselee dependent counseling. And the next thing is sometimes it may lead to new adjustment. And another very important thing is sometimes there is a chance for some mistakes to happen. So these are because mostly it is a counselor based counseling. So sometimes the client will not be fully extending his cooperation. So these are some of the important limitations of this directive counseling. So coming to the non-directive counseling, this non-directive counseling was first introduced by Carl Roger's, and some of the counselors even call this as Rogerian technique or Roger's technique. And this particular non-directive approach, usually it is from a layman point of view, it is also referred as a client-based counseling. So coming to the steps that are involved in this non-directive counseling, the first very important, here only we have 5 important steps that has to be followed in a non-directive counseling. The first very important thing is defining the problem or the situation. So the counselor will be understanding and will be defining the problem or the situation to the client. And the next thing is the counseling. Here we have to understand the first counseling, the directive counseling. Most of the solutions will be suggested by the counselor, but on the contrary, here the client will be given the option to express his feeling or his emotions, and also he will be given freedom to give his particular suggestions. And here the most important third step is the counselor will be identifying the counselee's feeling or the client feeling, and the counselor, after understanding this particular thing, will develop a counseling insight. So this insight is very simple. Only after developing this particular insight, we will be able to rectify the problem of the counselee or the client. And the last thing is, as usual, termination of counseling, and of course it is also followed by follow-ups. And here coming to the merits and limitations of this particular non-directive counseling, this is a very slow process, but it is a very steady process because mostly this is based on client's emotions and client's thoughts. So in long term, this particular non-directive counseling or this Rogerian technique will be helping the counseling a lot. And here no tests are used during the types of counseling, because mostly some of the emotional problems and some of the grief counseling, it can be handled in this particular session by using non-directive techniques. It removes emotional blocks and completely relieves the stress and the tension of the client. And some of the limitations of this particular technique is it is very time consuming, because first thing is the emotions and the thoughts of the client should completely come out, and another very important thing is the counselor should understand that. So it's a very gradual process and it's a very time consuming process, and sometimes due to some problem, the resources we will not be able to utilize fully, because suppose if the client is in one place and if the counselor is in one place, maybe during this pandemic when we are using this online technique, if we need to use that particular thing, means sometimes a resource may be a problem in this particular thing. And the next important thing is, since it is based on the client's insight, the self-motivation of the client is very important. So these are some of the important limitations of this particular non-directive counseling. The third important type of counseling is, what do we mean by the eclectic counseling? So eclectic counseling, it's very simple. It's none other than it's a combination of both directive and non-directive counseling. Sometimes in certain occasions or in certain cases, the counselor has to use a mixture of both this non-directive and directive counseling. So such counseling, we will be referring it as an eclectic counseling. So coming to the steps or coming to the process that we need to follow in eclectic counseling is, the first very important thing is the counselor should establish a very good rapport with the client. And the second thing is the counselor should diagnose the problem of the client, and automatically, which is followed by the analysis, because this analyzing thing is very important for solving the client's problem. And the next thing is here a tentative plan will be prepared by the counselor with the approval of the client, which will be automatically followed by counseling. And after counseling, once the goal is being achieved by the counselor, there will be termination of counseling, and of course which will be followed by another very important step, which is known as follow-up. So coming to the merits and limitations of this eclectic counseling, This eclectic counseling, coming to the merits, it's very cost effective and practical, because after analyzing the client, we will be able to decide. Sometimes we will start with the directive counseling, but suppose if there is some sort of positive change from the client, automatically the counselor has to shift from directive to non-directive. So in such cases, this particular eclectic counseling will be helping a lot, and this is a more flexible technique, and this motivates the client. And of course, after the solution, after coming up with a solution, maybe from the client side of client point of view, the client will be able to stick on to the solution for a very long time. And coming to the limitations of this particular counseling, here the role of the counselor is very sensitive, because the counselor should be professionally smart enough to decide when to shift from one counseling to another counseling. So it puts a lot of pressure on the part of the counselor. And the next very important thing is, as I have already mentioned, the counselor should be very skillful, because he should know when to prefer this directive and when to have a shift to this non-directive. So these are the three important types of counseling. So in this particular session, we discussed what do we mean by counseling. After that, we discussed what are the types of counseling. To sum up, there are three important types of counseling. The first thing is the directive counseling. The second thing is the non-directive counseling. And the third thing is, what do we call it as the eclectic counseling. It's very simple. It's a combination of both directive and non-directive counseling. Thank you.